So FIND stands for Forming Intersections and Dialogues, and really it comes out of, for those of us who have founded this project, out of living here in the UAE and feeling that our experience of living here has not coincided with the way that the UAE is portrayed in the media, and wanting to find a way to start unearthing some of the experiences that we have had on the ground and incorporating some of those perspectives and some of kind of the transnational experience of what has created this country. So our project consists of many different things. In some ways, as a research project, one of the things we're really asking ourselves is, what does a hybrid cultural laboratory look like? Is it possible to create something that has fellowships, has physical events, has digital events, has conferences, has exhibits online, but also in physical spaces, and also has a participatory element, both in a digital context, but also with communities on the ground doing workshops with children, adults, and in different places in the UAE. So here, if these are our fellowships, we have just started our fellowship program. We have 3 fellows. 2 of them are here this evening, and the third could not join us, Reem Falaknaz. Reem is studying mountain dwellers in Ras Al Khaimah. And she has done a beautiful job, and in about 6 weeks you'll be able to see her work on the site. And then we have Roberto Lopardo and Yasser, who will show you their work this evening. And the fellowships really are a way to support mid-career artists and scholars to take risks in their own work and to create a laboratory experience where they can do experiments, where the process is really what we're interested in. They have to give blog posts about their process, which we feature in the notebook. They're required to do 2 sets of workshops with the community, and then they also create work and projects that then they work in kind of a digital context with the technology team. We also have, we produce a journal and stories. So here you can see a bunch of different stories that we've just launched. So we have one on the bus station, one on the history of UAE currency, people who have dual citizenship who live in the UAE, a series on artists to artists, and a young woman who did a project on a house that she grew up in Abu Dhabi that then was inhabited by workers, and really looking at the experience of what that was, juxtaposing those 2 experiences. And then we have our notebook, which is really this place for the artists and the scholars to put down their reflections. And it also, we talk about design. The entire project is done in both Arabic and English, and that's one of the things in terms of the design team and what they've been thinking about is how do we start to do that in a way that's accessible to the communities here. And then we have here our events, where you can see what all of the fellows are doing and the different projects that we have. So this is our first public event of this scale, and I thank all of you for coming and joining us this evening. So now let me introduce Yasser and Roberto. Yasser Elsheshtawy is an associate professor at UAEU in architectural engineering. His research is focused on urbanization and developing societies, informal urbanism, and environment behavioral studies, with a particular focus on Middle Eastern cities. He authored and edited a series of books which include Dubai Behind an Urban Spectacle, The Evolving Arab City, and Planning Middle Eastern Cities. In addition, he has authored more than 70 publications in leading international journals and at conferences, and he has been invited to present his work at numerous international institutions. And he'll speak to you this evening about the work that he's been doing with FIND. Roberto Lopardo was born in Brooklyn. He carries an MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design, and he was previously a dean at AUD, and he has exhibited in many prominent venues, including the RISD Museum, the U.S. Consulate in Dubai, the Tenry Institute in New York, and the Emerson Gallery in Berlin. So thank you so much for joining us and for being part of the first fellows.
Good evening, and thank you, Mo, for the introduction. My work in this project represents a continuation of sorts to my previous research in Dubai, looking for spaces that are hidden and informal. Now, in this project, I'm conceptualizing this in a slightly different way by using the French term terrain vague. Introduced by architect Ignacy de Sola Morales, it implies both a physical locale and usually an abandoned space at the margins of a city and a condition. However, the term can suggest a variety of interpretations, something that is both residual, leftover, and ambiguous in its function and use. It can be a place where people come together to recall past history based on fragments and pieces. Or it can be an outlet for unexpected and spontaneous encounters. Informality is a central condition for terrain vague. It is not pre-planned or pre-programmed. It is a slow-up, which kind of sounds like an insult, but actually means spaces left over after planning. Yet perhaps two central conditions identified by those conceptualizing these terms are its emptiness, and therefore its potential to accommodate a variety of uses, and its marginality, which does not have to be physical, but can also be social and economical. And I found this conceptualization very much in line with the kind of research and work that I've been doing over these last few years. And I would very briefly like to talk about some of the sites that I've studied in Dubai, a city of spectacle, before describing my current project in Abu Dhabi with Find. Now, looking behind the spectacle, a series of sites are revealed, such as empty plots occupied by laborers in Bar Dubai, or sidewalks transformed into places of social gathering. In places like that, we can watch the flow of pedestrians and witness life as it unfolds. Small alleyways, street corners transcend their utilitarian function, as we can see here, for example, in the district of Satwa. Places like that are outside the managed environment. Alleyways reveal a different dynamic than the rest of the city. Walking through them opens up different vistas and surprise encounters. Some places, such as the Peshawar restaurant in Hor Al Anz in Dera, are known throughout the city and as a result acquire almost an iconic status among its low-income populace, and in the process generate an active street life around them. So the spectacle is a thin veneer. Going beyond this, one can find another world filled with a sense of urbanity, spaces that appear to be occupied and used, where a sense of time is palpable. Which brings me to the city of Abu Dhabi and my project there. A key question I asked at the beginning was whether I would find similar spaces in this city. And let me start with the actual location that I've decided on to investigate, and which I found to be a very good example of a terrain vague. So this clip here begins with an overview of the UAE and the location of Abu Dhabi. The camera then descends towards the actual locale, the geographical center of my study area, a small block containing a tree, a nondescript space, not particularly interesting or exciting, buried deep inside one of Abu Dhabi's notorious superblocks. And I've called it here Square with the Tree, and you'll hear more about this in a little bit. Now, as the camera zooms out, the surrounding context is established. This is right in the center of the city. The place has been called various names: Sector 13, E301, Markaziya. We see the landmarks, Zaid Mall, Central Market. The camera zooms out further, and you see the study area in context. So it is right in the middle of the city, a very interesting space. Now, I like the rather impersonal and detached view of the place, which is further emphasized by this time lapse, which I took from my hotel window, showing an actual view of the study area. So this is the block that I'm looking at, and this is how it changes over time. This was taken over the course of an entire day. We do not get a sense of the life and activities that unfold in the streets below. It is a top-down view, unconnected to what goes on in the street. And my aim here is to go beyond this and to reveal a city that is inhabited and occupied. When you look at this view, when you look at this time lapse, cars are moving and there is a kind of efficiency in the way the city operates. But we do not get a sense of the activities that take place there, of the encounters, of people meeting each other, of all the things that take place in that block. And the day ends. Now, I've been researching these sites since 2011 when I published a paper titled Informal Encounters. In it, I did a survey of places, of these places in Abu Dhabi and identified a series of vignettes. I'm not sure all of them, but this one here shows an informal prayer area, which is very common in many parts of Abu Dhabi. And in this case, it was an area that was blocked off by by a shop owner, and the prayer space was actively used by the block's inhabitants. And this vignette here took place in an area which I named at the time behind HSBC, which is actually the current site of my investigation. And I discovered this by chance as I was roaming the streets aimlessly, which again the French gave a fancy word for called dérivé or drifting. So that was my beginning encounter with that area. My point of entry was through an empty lot near an old and dilapidated building and a bus stop. The area attracted a lot of laborers and was quite visible from the street. Further inside the block, I found this spot here, the square with a tree, filled with people standing around and also sitting at its various restaurants. Since then, this image, this space had a very strong impact, and I always wanted to go back and investigate it further. Which brings me to the project that I'm currently working on with FIND, which is mapping Sector 13, E301, or simply Markaziyya, the central area of Abu Dhabi. And basically, I'm working at two scales, a macro scale, which involves the block as a whole, and a micro scale, looking at specific places within this block that are heavily used and act as a kind of center for the area. Now, with regard to the macro scale, I'm using something called behavioral mapping, which in urban and behavioral studies is a method for documenting activities within a given space. In this process, I had student assistants, forced assistants who were helping me. They were equipped with iPads and were tasked with identifying location of people on a GIS program that was loaded with a map of the areas. And the activities we were interested in were stationary activities as opposed to people moving. In addition to that, each point or each person identified on the map would be also qualified through different attributes. So we had this menu right here where we would have ethnicity, gender, age, whether the groupings are singular or double and so on, type of activity and that sort of thing. And there were also layers here which indicated different times of the days where students would be engaged in this mapping process. And the method itself involved dividing the block into 4 zones, with each student being responsible for one zone. And over the course of 1 month, starting mid-December and just finished a few weeks ago, on each Friday, we did all the mapping on Friday, each student would be responsible for one zone, and they would map activities for 3 hours, so 3 time periods. And basically, it's kind of like a walkthrough through the area that they were assigned to. And the idea was to have a kind of snapshot of the activities that take place. Following each mapping session, we would meet in my lab at UAE University to discuss the process. We would have a map right in front of us here on which I would record students' observation, any particular concerns, issues deriving from their encounter with the space. This was always very interesting and fun because of those students, only one actually is from Abu Dhabi, the others are from Al Ain. So for them even it was a process of discovery, of finding out about a place that they would never really have thought about visiting before. Now, after each mapping session, they would upload the data to a Dropbox folder, and then we would process this further in a GIS program by my lab assistant, who would also verify the points entered by cross-checking them with pictures taken in the field. I apologize, not very clear, but the results are a series of maps which document the use of the space. And this one here, if it's a little bit clearer, shows all the points from all time periods plotted in one diagram. And the outlines of the space are visible even without specific drawings or buildings. Here we see the points again with a site layout of the study area. Here is a close-up view which shows actually the square with a tree, and these are the observations for 6 p.m. Another interesting analysis is what in GIS is called KDM, or kernel density map, which identifies points of intensified activities, also called heat density. So here again, we have an aggregate map of all the points mapped, and then we ran this analysis covering the duration of a whole day. And we begin to see a series of nodal points, a series of focal points that really sort of stand up because there is a lot of activity there. And clearly, the ones that is used the most is here. This is the square with the tree. This is where all the activity happens. And then we also have this point right here, which is a bus stop. This is an informal prayer area. This one is a shop that sells cheap goods, which we kind of discovered later on. And we also have this kind of axis, which runs from Electra Street up until Hamdan and passes near a mosque. That's kind of like a main central area. Other parts of the block are darkened because nothing happens there. There's a school here, and here are a bunch of fancy high-rise buildings which are not particularly attractive or conducive to generating street use. Here we have that map again with the layout of the block, and it shows the time we cover from 9 a.m. till 10 p.m. and the total number of observed activities. These diagrams are also time specific in that they can be generated for each time period. And I've developed like a whole series of animations that show how density changes over time. And we are also in the process of analyzing the data in terms of gender and all these different attributes that we had. So we are currently working on that. So all of this so far is quite abstract. We're dealing with points, densities, and so on. Another layer to this study involves a deeper understanding of the space and how it is used by people. And in order to achieve that, I'm using two methods, still photography and time-lapse. Let me start with still photography. And the first step in this process was to develop an understanding about the streets, the entry points, sites of gathering based on the mapping process, and also major landmarks within and around the area. And the first point of interest is a kind of widening in front of a restaurant which appeared to be heavily used. This part is also closely connected to Electra Street, which appears in the back here. And what made this space even more interesting is that it seemed to replace a setting next door, which in my initial exploration in 2011 was a main node but lost that function because the building around which this was taking place is being torn down. And we see the building in the back here, boarded up. So that used to be a main gathering area, not anymore, so people have shifted towards this part right here. Moving further along, I ventured towards the square with the tree, which is, as you have seen in the map, is located in a sub-block within the larger superblock. And as is typical in such sites, parking lots, sidewalks, and street corners were all occupied by laborers. And here is the space again, as I remembered. Heavily occupied, but not really as busy as in 2011. Nevertheless, the activities did not change. The tree formed an anchor point of sorts, centering activities around it. Eating is a major function, of course, contributing to the area's attractiveness. Moving out of the square, I explored the block further, and I came across this informal mosque located between a sub-power station and a building. This area right here is located at the upper edge of the sector or the block and represents the top part of an underground garage, seemingly not used much. Although the mapping that we did show that it is actually used during the day. People use it to sit for sitting. At the end of this plaza, things do get more interesting. This is right next to the entrance of the mosque. Now, following this survey, the next step, and this was really the main part of the study, was to pick a space and study it further. And my intention here is to cover activities as they unfold over the course of the day. And not just that, but also to engage in a kind of informal conversation with people using the space. With that in mind, I decided on the square with a tree, which was the most intense space being used, and used time-lapse as a method for capturing the data that I'm interested in. The process itself involves setting up two cameras, one that would capture an aerial view, this one right here, with this very elaborate tripod, and the other records at eye level, right here. The aerial view camera was controlled wirelessly via computer, and both cameras had a built-in interval meter, which I programmed to record an image for every 5 seconds for the duration of 1 hour. I would repeat this process twice within one given time period. So basically, I had to remain in the space for 3 hours, which explains the chair on which I would sit, notebook in hand, eyes on the computer, and watching people around me. Naturally, being there aroused a lot of curiosity. So you see me right there, and this was taken by Fadi, who joined me one day, and right here. So that was always resulted in a lot of conversations with casual users, residents of the areas, and people just passing by. And the number of times I had to explain what I'm doing is really countless. I mean, people just kept asking me, what are you doing here? The impression always was that I was doing some kind of documentary, and then when they find out it's a university research, it just wasn't as exciting anymore. In any case, this conversation provided me with really a much deeper understanding of the space and cleared also many misconceptions that I had. So this is the time lapse, and I'm showing you both views here, where all clips were stitched together, and I overlaid it with a soundtrack, which was recorded on site corresponding to the different time zones that I covered. So it's about 3 minutes long. So this is the beginning of the day. The square, it starts at 7 a.m. The square is still empty, used for strictly functional purposes. Not many people around. And it more or less will remain like this up until perhaps noon time. Again, this is a Friday. It's a day off. So from early morning to morning, Activities pick up a little bit, but it's mostly about people coming back and forth, residents in the area, going about their business. Towards noontime, things pick up a little bit. This was during Friday prayers, so there's kind of a spike in activity. Now, in the afternoon and evening, the space becomes busier, and the users will increase till they reach a peak at around 7, 8 p.m. People here are residents from the area, from Abu Dhabi Island itself. Sometimes they come from labor camps. It's a strictly Bangladeshi community, so they are all from Bangladesh. This is the evening time, so this is where things really get sort of, where things beginning to pick up. We have a lot of groupings. And the restaurants in the back set up plastic chairs for people to sit on. Now, towards 9 p.m., something very interesting happens. People almost begin to disappear, and cleaners come in and begin to clean up the space, and more or less everybody's gone, and the space is being taken over by kids from who live in the surrounding buildings, play soccer. So the activities die down. But what does all of this mean? And how can any of this be of benefit aside from providing an interesting visualization tool? And there are several things we can do here. One of them is establishing what is called the diurnal rhythm of the space. As you see in this chart here, which shows a minute-by-minute count of number of people appearing in the scene. And this starts at 7 a.m. It stopped here at 7 p.m. We're still counting the remainder from 7 till 10 p.m. But we can clearly see a rhythm. It starts with a low number of people. It increases. This is around noon. And then the evening, of course, witnesses this higher number. Towards evening, it will go down. Another visualization is by mapping the locale of people, both moving and stationary, to get a sense of how they are distributed within the space and the extent to which various physical features contribute to the establishment of zones. And again, we are working on this. We are processing the images, and we are kind of plotting the people within the space, different time zones, and so on. We are also looking at degrees of privacy and separation from the city and the impact this may have on behavioral patterns and flow of movement. Now, in conclusion, I would like to talk a bit about the implications of this project. And basically, we can think of this in one of two ways. The first concerns what this means for architecture and urban design, and the second involves larger social and cultural issues. And let me just very briefly talk about those. Now, with regard to urban design, I have alluded to some implications in so far, but this diagram here shows a very similar project that we did in a different context. This is Baniyas Square in Dubai, where we also did the time lapse and we did the counting and so on. And using data from the time lapse, I'm trying to quantify various measures pertaining to urban livability and urban flow. I kind of got carried away here, but basically I'm working on developing two indices, a flow index and a vibrancy index, and this would facilitate comparison between spaces as well as provide urban designers with a kind of objective measure of space use. So that's one thing. The other, I guess, more interesting issue relates to the social use of the space and the users and inhabitants of these sites and their role within the city and how they are able to carve out a niche within a rapidly urbanizing center such as Abu Dhabi. It is also a story about how the city increasingly is turning its back to the most vulnerable of its inhabitants. And I want to illustrate that with two scenes. The first one is at the point where the block intersects with Hamdan Street. At the other side of the street is the newly opened ultra-luxurious World Trade Center Mall, which used to be the site of the old Central Market, demolished in 2005. And the image here, which I took prior to the market's demolition, shows the space active with users. A bit further down the road was Mullah Building, which used to be a vibrant center, its activities spilling out onto the front stage of the city with people occupying lawns. The building contained a passage housing a full-blown marketplace composed of shops, restaurants, and a hairdresser. A remarkable place in the midst of a bustling city. The building, this is a current picture, is now slated for demolition. All that remain are ruins. Remarkably, the building still attracts people, perhaps reminiscing about its past. So it seems with the Central Market gone and Mullah on its way, there are only a very few places left for such gathering. Which brings me to a main question that I'm trying to ask here. Why are we, architects, artists, writers, and filmmakers, so fascinated by these places? Does this kind of landscape, and I am paraphrasing Ignacio de Solas Morales again, visualize the urban in some primordial way? Morales reminds us that we are strangers in our city, and as inhabitants of the metropolis, we feel that the spaces not dominated by architecture are reflections of our own insecurity, of our vague wanderings through limitless spaces that, in our position external to the urban system, to power, to activity, constitute both a physical expression of our fear and our expectation of the other, the alternative, the utopian, and the future. We seek refuge in the margins of the city precisely when the city seems to turn its back on us, through a crushing homogeneity, a freedom under control. The enthusiasm for these vacant spaces, expectant, imprecise, and fluctuating, transposed to the urban, reflects our strangeness in front of the world, in front of our city, and before ourselves. How can architecture act in terrain vague without becoming an aggressive instrument of power? Undoubtedly through attention to continuity. Not the continuity of the planned, efficient, and legitimated city, but the flows, the energies, the rhythms established by the passing of time and the loss of limits. And I'll leave you with this image here, which was the last frame taken by the camera at 10:10 p.m. as I was wrapping up my last time-lapse session. Everyone left, a few people are standing around, and the space is taken over by kids playing soccer while the tree looms in the background. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Roberto Lopardo, and I've lived in Dubai for 10 years. I've been traveling the world for the last 25 years, I guess. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and for some crazy reason, I've ended up here for the last 10 years, and I've actually quite enjoyed my time. And about 7 years ago, I realized that I didn't really understand where I was living, where I had sort of landed. And so I began to explore my environment in a way that was not necessarily common to me. So going back 7 years, I'm sitting in my office at the American University in Dubai and sort of just finished a day of lecturing classes. And I'm sitting behind my desk and I realized that I had not actually stepped foot outside of the campus of American University in Dubai in probably over a month. And that's strange, but it's a self-contained community, so it's not that strange. There's a barber, there's a restaurant, there's friends, there's my work. So it's a self-contained community. So there's really no reason ever to walk beyond those walls. And it was a bit of a strange thing when I sort of realized that. So I made a plan, and somehow this plan evolved into a 24-hour experience. I was going to walk out of the university and experience the city around me for 24 hours. And that's what I did. So I packed up a little knapsack, I did this once when I was a really young kid, you know, when you want to run away and you tie a little bundle and you put it, I felt like that. I felt like I'd tied my life to the back of a handkerchief and sort of had walked off. But I filled a knapsack with some apples and water and a camera and some stuff, Snickers bars, and really satisfies. And I was dropped off by a friend in a very random part, sort of along the border of Sharjah and Dubai, along the airport. And I was dropped off there and said goodbye, and I sort of just started walking. And I had no idea really what I was in for. I just kind of, I was just going to take a walk. And every minute I was going to take a photograph. So I have a little digital watch, which I'm wearing right now, which I am going to set off. So you're going to see how annoying this is. So every minute, my watch rings, and I would stop walking, and I would just take the camera, and I'd place it in front of me, and just take a photograph. The first project I did, I've done 13 of these. The first one I did, I carried really heavy equipment. I carried a tripod, I carried a professional camera, a lot of backup, different lenses. By the time I hit the second one, I had a tiny little point-and-shoot camera, little Sony NEX, because I realized that was what I needed. And so as I'm walking and as the watch is going off, I'm taking photographs, and I'm walking and walking and I'm taking photographs. And the day is sort of passing in front of me, and I'm beginning to honestly feel like I'm exploring the city. And it kind of goes back to when I was a little boy growing up in Brooklyn. That's what I hear every minute. And it kind of goes back to when I was a little boy in Brooklyn when we used to play a game called roofing. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. But it's sort of, the object of the game is to get on a roof, the lowest roof around you. And you get on the roof, and then you never touch the ground. You just jump from roof to roof to roof to roof. And you kind of explore the city like a little monkey on top of roofs. And that's what we would do. And we thought it was very common. I mean, we never thought about the risk of falling or anything like that. It's just something we did. And that experience has stayed with me throughout my life. I remember walking these rooftops, sort of following the angles of the roofs and following these roofs as they went from building to building, and exploring everything and looking down at people walking below me and looking at plants and looking into people's backyards and sort of seeing things that probably I shouldn't have seen because these are private areas. And I carry that experience with me. And later on, as I grew up, when I went to college, I met a good friend of mine who's grown up in a farm. And his experience was quite interesting in that it paralleled my experience, but his urban jungle was natural. It was a natural ecosystem. So he did the same thing along rivers and trees and farms and fields. And so he would walk along these spaces and do the same things that I was doing in the city as a kid, which was sort of climbing and going up and down roofs. So this is kind of when, so fast forward back to Dubai, and I'm taking photographs every minute, and I'm exploring the city for the first time in what I feel like is a very genuine and authentic way. The result of all of this is 1,440 images. And they're set up, I'm going to stop that because this will drive you crazy, but I just wanted to get you a feeling for how that works. So they're set up so the first minute starts at the left-hand side of the grid. There's 60 images across, so one image per minute. There's 24 rows, 24 hours in a day, so 1,440 images total. And what you can see is in this one, I started during the daytime, and I ended during the daytime, so the nighttime has been blocked up in the middle, sort of that change in light. You can see how the city changes, how the light is changing inside the city. So I'll show you a couple of close-ups also. Oops. So this is at 2:44 a.m., 2:52 a.m. I started walking, for those of you who are familiar with Dubai, I started walking along Media City. I lived in Media City at the time where American University is located, and I walked down Beach Road where the palaces are, and then I arrived at the Madinat, the Jumeirah Madinat, the Burj Al Arab, and then I sort of turned and started going towards Sheikh Zayed. So this is somewhere along there. The images are, interestingly, to me, the least interesting part of the project. And that's strange because I'm a photographer by nature. I studied photography, I've studied analog photography, and I've studied digital photography, and images are very important to me. I don't like communicating with people. Sorry. I'm not very good at using my words, as I was once told. I'm much better at communicating with images. So for me, image making is very important. It's a way that I feel comfortable communicating with people. But interestingly, somehow, in this project, where this is the result, the images become less and less important. The individual frame becomes less and less important. And I think what becomes more important is that overall experience, especially for me as the artist. As an audience, I've seen audience members engage this project in various ways. At times, they'll get really close to this 6 meter object. It's a 6 meter object. They'll get very close to it, and they'll look at individual frames, and then they'll start to sort of analyze them in relation to other frames around them. And at other times, I see people take a step back and look at the overall perspective and think about the light of the piece, think about maybe how the little intermingling parts fit together. So there's various ways to approach it. Let me show you a couple more images before I move on. So this is the daytime. This is a collection of images that I had found inside of windows. It's amazing the symbols that are thrown at us on a sort of regular interval. This is Mapping Istanbul, and you can see the color palette was quite different. In Mapping Istanbul, I started at sunrise, and I ended at sunrise. Very dynamic city with a lot of energy, a lot of motion, very different than Dubai, older city. But what was incredibly different about Istanbul was the amount of energy. About 4 o'clock in the morning, there was still a lot of activity in front of me. Whereas in Dubai, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I was walking around, I was pretty much had the city to myself, the streets to myself. Here's a couple of close-ups of Istanbul. I started talking about the importance of the image and the surprise that how unimportant the image was. And I want to talk a little bit about the difference between analog photography and digital photography. My training is in photography, and I learned how to use a camera. This was my professor's camera, and I bought it from him. He sold it to me. I was very happy to have it. It's a beautiful camera, and you take a picture looking at it, from above. It shoots about 12 to 16 images. It's film-based. And it's a lovely camera, and it does what it's supposed to do quite well, which is take images. It takes a little time to kind of get to understand how this equipment works. It's a remarkable piece of equipment with no batteries, nothing like that. And from there, we've gone, to here. And throughout my studies and throughout my time with the camera, I've experienced that shift. And I'm very, very curious about it. I'm very curious about what it means to take an image using this as opposed to what it means taking an image using that. And I think that's where this project really has grown as an academic. From an intellectual perspective, that's where this project has grown. And I can tell you that one of the things about analog is that things are precious. When you take a picture, it's very expensive. A roll of film is very expensive. To process that roll of film is very expensive. To process the image that comes from that negative is quite expensive. The whole thing takes a long time. So in order to get an image, you have to invest money and time. And that makes that object in front of you, what you choose to frame, incredibly important. On the other hand, on the digital side, taking an image could never have been easier. You just snap at anything and everything you want. And everything is expendable. You can remove an image at will. There's no reason to have to feel like you lost something because you took an image and it wasn't to your liking. So we'll get rid of it. Her hair was a bit off, his smile was a bit off, I don't know, there was somebody walking in front. Okay, we'll just toss it. Or, we'll just kind of put it aside. That hurts when you're shooting large format and medium format film because you've set up that image for a very long time. In large format, the next step up from medium format, you're taking one image, and that image takes maybe an hour or two to set up. You've been setting up lighting, you've been setting up models, you've been setting up the situation in front of you. So it takes hours and hours to process that image and get it proper. You lose that image and you feel even worse. So there's something about the evolution from here to here that has brought us to a point where images were quite precious at one point, and now they've become less precious. And I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing, but I'm just interested in trying to understand what it is. I'm not putting a value on it. I'm not saying this is good and this is bad, or that's bad and that's good. I'm just interested in sort of the dialogue, the debate around that. This is Mapping Jerusalem. As I'm talking, I'll just keep flipping on pieces. Mapping Jerusalem, again, you can see the color code of Mapping Jerusalem was really different than the color codes of the other two cities. So as I'm going along and I'm looking at this dialogue, I'm looking at this kind of experience between digital and analog and trying to understand it, I begin to realize that I want to try a project. I want to do something that no longer holds the image at that level of preciousness. That image is no longer so important. And that was very difficult for me because it's a skill set that I held on to quite tightly. So this project is actually, as you can see, and as I've said, the image is lost. The image is no longer relevant. And that was very difficult for me to do. And I think that's one of the experiences that's one of the takeaways. Okay, yeah. So as we said, the other interesting thing about analog versus digital, the analog world has been explored to the nth degree. There have been tremendous amount of benchmarks placed that say this is what analog is capable of. This is what I can do with an analog camera. And there have been tremendous practitioners that have come along over the years, and they've produced bodies of work that are quite remarkable. And so as an analog photographer, you hold that up somewhere. You hold that trophy up and you say, this is what's possible. And you measure yourself to that. The thing about digital that I find remarkable is there's less benchmarks. There's less trophies that have been created throughout the history of digital, which is quite young. And so there's less things to compare yourself to. There's less things to compare your achievements to. And that's quite exciting. It's daunting, but it's also exciting. You don't really know what you're doing, and if what you're doing is good, bad, right, wrong, you just kind of are stumbling along in the dark and just trying to figure it out. That's really exciting, but again, it's also sort of unnerving. In analog photography, you have this umbrella, you have this clear boundary that's been drawn. You know where you exist. You don't know where you exist in this world. I find that interesting. The other thing that I find quite interesting about the digital revolution is that events become mediated through this machine. So if something happens and what do we all do? If there's a fire, if there's a car accident, if there's a friend that comes into town, the first thing most of us have learned to do is take the camera out of our pocket, take the phone out of our pocket, and to mediate that event, and to kind of, rather than experience that event one-on-one, what's happening right in front of you, you put something in front of you. You put this machine in front of you, and you videotape it, or you take a photograph of it. And you do that in order to try to maybe understand it. Maybe you walk away a few hours later, and you look at that video, and you look at that photograph, and you try to understand what happened. But that's remarkable, because there's something happening right in front of you, and rather than experiencing it head-on, it's kind of like saying, okay, I'm going to experience this later. I'm not going to look at it right now. I'm going to put something in front of me, and I will deal with it later. I find that quite remarkable, and I think digital has emphasized that. Photography has always done that because you do put a camera in front of you, but digital has just emphasized the entire thing and made everything in that manner. So let's talk a little bit about the pace of exploration. The other thing that's really important to me about the mapping project, and the reason why it's been created in the way it has, is because of the pace at which I'm exploring the environment. Most of us are propelled through an environment in a vehicle, 120 kilometers an hour. We're driving down Sheikh Zayed Road, going down Electra Boulevard. Is it Electra Boulevard or is it Electra Street? Electra Street. Doesn't it sound better as a boulevard? No. Electric Street, and so you're driving through Electric Street, and so you're in the comfort of your car, and you're driving, and it's a capsule, and you have your music on perhaps, and the world is outside of you. And maybe you're catching images, maybe if you're on the passenger side, you're catching things that's happening around you, but it's happening so quickly. And what I find incredibly rewarding is when time is slowed down, and instead of experiencing time at that speed, you slow it down to this speed. You slow it down to the speed where you put one foot in front of the other, and when that watch goes off, you really haven't moved that far. In 1 minute, perhaps I can get, from here to the entrance, perhaps. And so from here to the entrance, I'm constantly surveying everything in front of me and trying to see where the next photograph is going to be. And so the things that I'm looking at, the speed at which I'm looking at things changes dramatically. And that's really important, I think, as well. It's another important part of this project. So let's fast forward to Find. A few months ago, was it a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago? 4 months ago. 4 months ago, I began a dialogue with Find. And the questions they asked were quite interesting and quite basic, and it was simply, where do you go next? How do you evolve? Is there a reason to evolve? Can this project evolve into something new or something else? And can technology help you? And as you can already see, I like this. This sits on my bedside table. This one sits in my office. So there's a bit of separation. So when I think about technology, I tend to cringe. And technology is a big word, but when I think about sort of the potential of what technology can do, I don't embrace it. I kind of get a little bit hesitant. I think that it can interfere with something. But I was challenged with that question, and I took it to heart, and I tried to understand how I could work to evolve this project. And one of the first things I thought is that this is very close to the moving image. It's already very close to being a movie. It's just a still movie, right? I mean, every image is represented, it's just not moving. But you can imagine that this can have motion in it. The image is no longer suspended on its own. It's suspended in a plethora of images. So in all of this, you see a sequence, you see a narrative, and you can feel that this can become full of movement. So I changed I didn't actually, I used the same camera, but I used video mode. So I started taking, my idea was to make videos instead of photographs. So I did 20-second clips, 20-second video clips every minute. And I've called it Moving Abu Dhabi, as I did the project about a week ago. So about a week ago, I came to Abu Dhabi, and I started the project at midnight. I decided I wanted to trap the light in the middle of the grid this time around. So I started the project at midnight, and it ends at midnight, and the light is trapped in the middle. And I took a video every minute for 20 seconds. There's a couple of takeaway points. I'll show you a few of the videos. Still in the process of editing all these videos. Let me show you a few of them. I've decided to remove sound, one step at a time. So maybe at some point sound will come back into this. But at this point, I'm still really interested in trying to understand what's in front of me visually. One of the things that I noticed immediately was that my confrontation with the subject matter in front of me was far more intense than it was with a photograph. With a photograph, I was there for about 1/30 of a second, and then I was able to move on. So it's a difficult thing to point a lens in the direction of a person who is not aware of what you're doing, because there's an immediate suspicion. And constantly during this 24-hour period, throughout all of these cities, I'm a little bit on edge, because the people that I'm pointing the camera towards are usually suspicious to a certain extent as to why I'm taking a picture of them. And with this project, I had to actually point the camera at them for 20 seconds. So the engagement, the level of engagement was far more intense. And one of the things that happened, and this was kind of remarkable because I didn't expect this, one of the things that was remarkable is that most of the people that did agree to stand in front of the camera thought I was taking a photograph. And so it became this very awkward thing, and it happened over and over and over again. And you have people who are posing to take their image. You know, they're happy that I'm taking a photograph of them. And I don't know how to, it's a minute. Things are happening really fast. It's a 20-second clip. I need to move on to the next one. I don't have time to explain to each person what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So it's really difficult for me to say, well, you know, this is actually a video. It's not. So I just sort of allow the person to encounter me and to deal with the equipment in the manner in which they will. And so in a lot of portraits, I have portraits of people standing still for 20 seconds, which is odd. I think what's beautiful about the project, I think what's beautiful for me about the project is how incredibly mundane things that we just take for granted that are around us become interesting, become something of value. You know, the way I like to sort of consider it is, and it goes back to hiking, it goes back to hiking up a mountain, hiking down a trail. A lot of people who like to hike, they hike with an intent to get to an end point. So they hike up Mount Everest in order to get to the top of Mount Everest and then say, I've been to the top of Mount Everest, and plant a flag on top of Mount Everest. But what I find fascinating is that it takes hours, days, weeks, months of preparation to get up to Mount Everest or to get to where you want to go. And that whole process is sort of ignored or demeaned, and it's sort of put a little bit below the fact that what's most important is this. What's most important is when I get to the end point, whatever the end point might be. And I find that interesting, and I find that a bit disturbing. I do it myself throughout my life. So what this project, I think, forces is sort of a reconciling of the fact that what's in front of us on a daily basis might not be ideal. It might not be perfect. It might not be exactly what we imagine our cityscapes to be, imagine what our lives are, imagine who our neighbors are, what our interactions, our social interactions are. They're not ideal, but they are what they are. They're real. This is what I was able to see in Abu Dhabi. I was not a tourist. I was not told where to go. I don't know Abu Dhabi too well. I don't know where the cool hangouts are. I don't know where people would be on a Thursday night, or where I could find an interesting amount of activity. I just sort of am dropped in all the cities that I've done. I've been dropped as an alien, and there I go, and I experience the space. And what's really interesting is this is what you see. What I've always found interesting about photography versus film is that in photography, this is what's left behind. This is all you have. And you walk away, and this is what you have. Film destroys this, and that's lovely in a way, and it's also very disturbing in a way. Film does not allow this to exist because there's the next moment, and that next moment has to take precedent over the first moment, and it's going to it's going to do that. And then the next moment comes along and it'll take over after the moment before that. And so there is no this. There is no still. There is no moment of reflection where you can kind of focus and say, this is what I'm looking at, because things are constantly in motion. So that's something that the way I tried to offset that is, as you can see in a lot of the videos that I've done, is there's no tracking of objects. So it's really a still, and I'm allowing things to interact with that still as they may. So I'm not tracking objects and following things and introducing movement that's artificial. That's something, again, that I think as I keep doing these projects, I'd be curious to see how my camera work becomes more and more important to how this project gets realized in the end. So that's where I am right now. What I'm really excited about is, for the first time, Moving Abu Dhabi will be online. It will be shown through an online platform. I've never had my work exhibited online. It's always been exhibited as a piece of sculpture, as an actual object. So I'm excited to see how this 1,440 videos will live online, how people will interact with it online. So stay tuned. It will be online, so you'll be able to see all the videos. And thank you.
So thank you so much for showing and sharing the work that you've been doing over the last few months. I'm just going to start off the discussion, and then I'm curious to open it up for questions. But I'm curious to know, you've been involved in these projects, and you've been talking with one another about the process. We've been meeting on a monthly basis, kind of sharing what you've been working on, but this is the first time that you've really seen each other's work. And part of tonight is really thinking about the relationship and the dialogues that can happen between a scholar and an artist. So I'm curious, now that you've had a chance to see each other's work, what you think about it and how it relates to your own work and what you're doing. And maybe Yasser, if you want to start with that.
Yeah, actually, we had a conversation, right, at like, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and we were talking about our methodologies and our process, and I think it became very clear that we're working quite differently, and we're using different methods, and I think the process is quite different, but we share one very important concern, which is trying to sort of humanize the city, right, to make it, to reveal a side of the city that is not impersonal, but that a city as lived. So I think that it was really, but I haven't seen like how you're going to actually develop this. So watching this now, I was just absolutely fascinated. But I also kept thinking how different it is from what I'm doing, right? I'm coming from an architectural background as well. It's sort of, I'm more interested in the practicality of things, like what do these things mean? But I guess that there is one aspect that I found to be, that we might share, and I don't know how you feel about that, but it's the rhythm. That there is a kind of rhythm that when you show some of these videos, how like the cleaning machine or the car as it enters into the, so that sort of rhythm that takes place. You're showing it, of course, in a different time zone. I mean, that's actually real time. I'm showing it through time lapse. But I guess that's something that's really interesting and that you find in cities throughout the world, and it's something that potentially tell you a lot about cities and how they function, how that particular rhythm takes place, and I think it might be different from one city to the next, something like that. I mean, these are just some initial thoughts, I guess. Regarding that.
This is the first time I've seen the presentation as well, and one of the things that I found incredibly rewarding about what I just saw in your work is the time-lapse video, and how the time-lapse video of the tree, and how you can really start to understand how that space is being used. In a very short period of time, you've been able to explain to us how a public square is used. It's quite difficult to do. It's quite difficult to sort of package that and say, this is the way you enter the square, this is the way you exit the square, this is the way people utilize the square, these are the different groups that come in at different times, and to do that in a time lapse and to do it in a format that is succinct and yet clear is quite interesting. And these what's interesting is all the photographs that you showed, I sort of started thinking about the encounters that I had had with people that were quite similar to the people that were in your photographs. And I'm thinking, oh, I feel like I met that guy, or I feel like I was on that street, or I feel like, you know, when you were showing workers at one point, I remember sitting with them for a while, and I thought, I remember that. And there's something that is beautifully overlapping about the two works. But there is something also quite different, and I think it has a lot to do with analysis and how you're analyzing the material you're collecting, as opposed to how I'm not analyzing the material I'm collecting, and why these things are divergent is an interesting thing for the audience to sort of think about.
But of course you are analyzing it in the sense of whenever you choose what clips, or even, you know, what you chose to show us now, there's a sense, maybe it's a more intuitive analysis, but there is some kind of making decisions about, you know, what you're going to show and why, and what you're going to shoot, and
absolutely, right? Absolutely, and it's one of the things that I've actually kind of struggled with right from the beginning, because I sort of have tried to resist temptations by others to label these projects as political in some manner, as this is sort of an authority, or this is an authoritative, is that the right word? Authoritative. Yeah, authoritative overview of a city, of a space. And I've sort of resisted that, because I want to feel as if I'm a neutral observer. But I don't think I am a neutral observer. I don't think it's possible. I think I try to be a neutral observer, but all of the history that I've collected throughout my life, all the images that I've collected throughout my life, they come back somehow, they creep back into the forefront when I'm framing something or when I'm observing something. So there is definitely a choice. There is something that's happening there. As loose as it gets at times, it's still, I can't let go.
I mean, I love this idea of the observer. With Yasser, I was saying to you earlier how when you see these pictures of behind the scenes with Yasser in his, you know, almost like a beach chair and this plastic stool, and he's kind of setting up for the day with his camera. And clearly you're also a real presence there. And how does that feel when you started doing these kinds of projects? How did you find your way into that and feeling confident enough to just go and observe?
It started in Dubai when I was doing this, but this was really the most extensive that I've ever been doing that. I mean, really setting up a chair and just creating that space around me. And it's kind of daunting at the beginning, because while you are placing and creating that setup, you are being watched, you are being observed, and people look at you, and there is this kind of curiosity, right? At the beginning, I found it sort of uncomfortable a little bit, you know, but it actually became a way for me to interact with the people around me, and it even became part of the method. I mean, I would actively sort of elaborate on the process, setting up things just to prompt people to come to me and talk to me and things like that. So that was definitely part of the process, and something that I sort of welcomed at some point. But the other thing is, one of the things that concerned me while I was doing this is if my presence, because again, Robert, you were talking about this objective observer, right, and that sort of thing. If my presence, by putting the camera and the tripod and doing all of this, if that somehow alters the behavior of the people around me, if that changes what's happening. And I don't really have a good answer to that. My hope is not that at some point, you know, people will just realize, yeah, this guy with the camera, you know, and then they will just move on. But we're also using different methods and tools to observe what's happening. But that is definitely part of the process as well, that me being there, even though I'm trying to be detached as much as I can, it plays a role or it influences what's happening. And the question is, what does that say about the space and about the people and about the area, you know?
Yeah. Hi, thanks to both of you. It was a really enjoyable presentation. Roberto, I'm wondering if you discovered whether your images reflected the demographic here between local people, indigenous people, and the people that are working here?
The hotel that I chose to stay in, which was kind of random. I mean, I went online and looked up cheap hotels, and I found a cheap hotel on Electra Street. Sort of plays a role in where this whole project started. So it started on Electra Street, and it kind of radiated outward. And one of the things that I found really very, very interesting is that I found very, very few local people on the street, which I did make note of. I mean, I'm not going to go and try and find different groups of people, but I did note at some point in the sort of 12 hours, 14 hours into the performance, I realized there were very, very few local people walking the streets in the area that I had been in. And perhaps that's because simply it's the neighborhood that I was in. Perhaps it was the day I shot on a Thursday. Maybe, I don't know why that happened, but that was very, very, I was very aware of that. Out of the 1,440 videos, very, very few, maybe 2-3% of them are actually have film of local people in them.
Okay, thank you.
As I'm looking at the photos, I'm a pedestrian, I walk a lot, and I know that as a woman, I'm like one of the, there's less of us, but there are women in Abu Dhabi on the streets, and there are people in Dubai that are women. And so I'm just really surprised that I'm not seeing any females, and I'm wondering if you can explain perhaps what was going on between the camera and the females that were on the streets. I mean, walking.
The space that I've looked at, that square, it is an exclusively male zone. I mean, all the people who hang out there are bachelors from Bangladesh, and it is. There are women who pass by, but usually it's residents in the area, and they pass by quickly. They don't remain in the place. And it has to do with the demographics of Abu Dhabi and the particular structure and the way these laborers are brought here. They cannot bring their families and so on. So this becomes their main hangout, and it would be very uncomfortable for a female or a group of females to just stand there like the rest of the laborers. However, they pass through the space, and I haven't really witnessed any sort of harassment or threat or anything like that. I mean, it's a quite safe area, but it's something that you see in many of these spaces, whether it is in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi. It's quite common, and it has to do with a particular demographic structure that exists. But you cannot describe them, obviously, as diverse spaces. Clearly, they are not. They are exclusive male zones.
Again, I was surprised at what I saw. I agree with you. There are female pedestrians in Abu Dhabi, and you're only seeing 8 videos. There's another, whatever the math is, 1,300 and et cetera videos. But I was very, very surprised by how few females I saw on the street, and the few that I did videotape, I also. There's levels of comfort and there's levels of discomfort. And there was a level of discomfort often when I placed the camera in front of a female and videotaped her. Because of the norms of the society, I'm worried that there's a better chance of something poor happening as a result of pointing a camera in the direction of a woman here as there would be if you pointed in the direction of a man. And that's just, over the 10 years that I've been here, I've been told over and over again, it's just something, and as a professor with my photo students, I would tell them over and over again, is be careful when you point a direction, when you point a camera in the direction of a woman in public, because it's not socially acceptable. So I think that is changing, and it's changed quite rapidly, in Dubai at least, and I'm more comfortable there because I know the streets there. But I was not comfortable in Abu Dhabi. It's really strange how we're only an hour and a half up and down the street, and yet I felt like I was in a very different place here. And so I don't know what the rules are And therefore, I err on the side of caution. And I chose with intent not to videotape a lot of the women that I saw.
So Yasser, I noticed that you had said that since 2011 in the square with the tree, the population of the amount of people that were hanging out there kind of went down, you said. Do you think that more people will start hanging out there, or do you think that it will continue to dwindle by 2016?
That's a good question. Actually, it's something I kind of discovered at the end while I was talking to one of the shop owners there. Because I remember clearly, with the first time I discovered this space, it was just packed with people. You could hardly walk. Now it's much, much less. And there are two reasons for that. The first one is that many of these workers at the time in 2011 were illegals. They had illegal visas, they overstayed, there was... since then, there has been a kind of crackdown, and many of these illegals have been removed. So that's one thing. The other thing is that many would come from Dubai, from labor camps in Dubai, in Al-Quoz and so on. Now that is being stopped. You cannot take a bus or a minivan or whatever and come over here. You will be stopped by the police. In fact, in that area, in that block that I studied, many of the laborers from within Abu Dhabi, my students would tell me they would use what they call illegal taxis, or like these are like informal ways to transport laborers from camps to that space. But the ones who come from Dubai, from elsewhere, that has lessened to a great degree. So that's one reason why it sort of is less now. You're asking about the future. I think the future is not promising for these laborers, and my sense is there's a kind of concerted effort to push them out, and it's sort of the point I was trying to make at the end, because they are perceived as a problem when you have so many laborers for a variety of reasons. So I think it's going to become less and less, and places like that will eventually disappear.
Thank you.
Thank you both for two very insightful presentations. What Yasser spoke of urban mapping, I thought obviously is very relevant and very important in today's society for very many reasons. I'm just wondering to what extent photography and urban mapping would be important to reinstate what Gaston Bachelard called the poetics of space in societies which have been disturbed or damaged after conflict or natural disasters, or is it useful at all to reinstate that society?
How photography will play a role in
urban mapping, in the sense, if you are to reinstate a social setting which was there before before conflict, can urban mapping help?
Oh, okay. Yes, I think it definitely plays a role. I mean, it has to do with urban memory and sort of trying to capture what has disappeared. If you think of the city as a palimpsest, right? Something is being erased and so on. So, for instance, I showed that image of the Central Market, which has been demolished, right? Which is a kind of disaster in a way, right? It's something that has been forcibly removed. And I've documented that space quite extensively, and I always write about it. And in a way, it contributes to reviving urban memory. So photography definitely plays a role here, because these places are quite fleeting, and they may not last. So you want to somehow preserve that memory. So I think, yes, it plays a very significant role in that regard.
Thank you. I think it's wonderful tonight, and I'm so sorry that Reem couldn't be here, because she would have added a whole other perspective, the third fellow who has been documenting the mountain dwellers up in Ras Al Khaimah. But I think something that you both have found in doing these fine fellowships is really bringing this sense of just the ordinary and seeing it in this extraordinary context, really seeing what makes some of these moments that seem so mundane, and like you said, you may have certain expectations, but it's just watching men gather around a tree, or watching a car get washed, or someone write something that actually starts to bring meaning to our environment. and to get us to kind of a sense of more intimacy and make it more knowable in terms of the place where we live. So I really thank you for the work that you both are doing. And thank you so much for coming this evening and sharing tonight with us.
Thank you.